This is our teaching video for confirmation on the first of the Ten Commandments. I'm going to show you a 1-minute clip from a Mel Brooks movie. You may have to turn up the sound a little bit because of the way the software captures, but it'll be a fun and funny way to get into our discussion about the Ten Commandments.
Moses went to the mountain, and God spoke unto him.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. A deaf man could hear you.
What?
Nothing, Gonish, forget it. Oh, Lord, why have you chosen me? What would you have me do for you?
I shall give you my laws, and you shall take them unto the people.
Yes, Lord. Lord, I shall give these laws unto thy people. Hear me. Oh, hear me. All pay heed. The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 10 commandments for all to obey.
Of course, the very famous joke from that, and even if you couldn't hear it well, is that God gave Moses 15 commandments, but he dropped one tablet and they went down to 10. Well, actually, if you look at the Bible, and particularly we mean the Old Testament. Now, if you don't know what the Old Testament is, it's basically everything from the beginning up to Jesus. If you look in the Old Testament, God gives more than 10 commandments. There are actually 613 laws that God gives the people of the Old Testament. In fact, I'm just going to scroll down for you. Here's a list of the 613 laws. Now imagine if confirmation, instead of studying the 10 commandments, we studied and made you memorize the 613 laws. Now, of course, they're not given simply as a list of laws, but these are laws that people of the Old Testament, especially the Jews, have taken, or specifically the Jews, have taken and categorized into these 613 laws. What's important for you to know is that the Ten Commandments aren't just part of these 613 laws. Like we say, well, there's 603 laws we really don't think you need to know about. In fact, when God gives the Ten Commandments, they're actually called the 10 words. So they're not even called in the Bible the Ten Commandments. And if you want, this comes to us from Exodus 20. I know one of the students said after last week's video she went and read them. But they're called the 10 words, and one of the things that's happened is there are two ways to number them. And this is just so you know, as Lutheran students, that when you encounter the 10 Commandments in public, they may not be numbered the same way you're going to learn them. We're actually numbering them the older way. Alright, so this is oftentimes what the 10 Commandments look like in public. I am the Lord thy God, the first one. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. And then if you look down here at the end, thou shalt not covet is one command. So most of the time when the Ten Commandments appear in America, they appear in this form. But actually the way you're going to learn them is in this form, and this isn't quite as clear to read. You'll notice that Commandments 9 and 10 are broken up, so it's two commands about coveting, and then actually the first commandment that talks about worshiping God and idols, that's all put together into one. So the reason there's a little bit of confusion in the numbering is the Bible does not ever say, this is the first commandment, these are the second commandments, this is the third commandment, this is the fourth commandment. The Bible simply says God has 10 words for you, and there's some flexibility of how you number them. And so the way you're going to be taught them in Lutheran confirmation is this way, and you still get all the same information, it's just a matter of presentation. Before we actually look at the text itself, I want to share some information with you, some geographical information. This is a picture of Mount Sinai, and Mount Sinai is in Egypt, and these are people, obviously, who are walking to the top of the mountain in our time. You know, they're dressed like us, and they're probably tourists or pilgrims. This is the mountain in Egypt where God appeared and gave them the Ten Commandments. So one of the things I want you to remember is that the story of God and the people It's not just some kind of fairy tale where it just happened in a book, but there are geographical places that we can go to and understand or revisit where God did great work. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of is mountains are very important in the Bible, but mountains are also very important in human religion in particular. So it's no mistake that Moses meets God on this mountain as if this were God's house. And I want to show you some pictures now of some other famous mountains, just to give you an idea that mountains play an important part in human religion and the desire for God. This is actually Mount Olympus in Greece, and you'll notice Mount Olympus isn't just one mountain, but has, I think, over 50 peaks. And so Mount Olympus is a real mountain. It's not just something they made up that you have to study. But mountains were seen as the dwelling place of God. Now, if you were to travel to Iraq, you would see this. It's called a ziggurat, kind of a precursor to a pyramid. And it was making an artificial mountain so that people could climb these stairs and worship at the top. It was like combining the heaven and the earth. So there was this sense of needing to get to a high place so that you could meet God and worship God. This is actually a model of a Babylonian ziggurat from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And if you say, I've never heard the word Babylon, or I've never heard the name Nebuchadnezzar, then you can read your Bible, the book of Daniel, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Ezekiel, the book of Isaiah, the book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah. All of these books are kind of in this time of when people built this ziggurat in Babylon, modern day Iraq. Again, an artificial mountain on top of which you see this blue temple, which is where they worshipped their god. Now, interestingly enough, not only did this happen in like Iraq and Israel and Egypt, but you can go to like Mexico and the Mayans. The Aztecs created these kinds of artificial mountains where they could worship. The Chinese created artificial mountains where they could worship or where important people could be buried. And you can imagine the Great Pyramids in Egypt the same. So there's a kind of desire to meet God at the mountain in the human heart. And so God shows up on a particular mountain. And for you who are Christians, the mountain that's significant, at least for the Ten Commandments, is Mount Sinai in Egypt. Now, when the people get to Jerusalem, they build their temple, God's house, on a mountain, the Temple Mount. When Jesus is crucified, he's crucified on a mountain, a little mountain called Mount Calvary. And so being lifted up and being brought close to God is a theme. Mountains are very important in the story of the Bible. Well, if you remember our first video, we talked about saying yes to what? That was what we asked. What are we actually saying yes to? And what we're saying yes to is relationship with God. And that's something that God accomplished in baptism. God made the relationship. But it's also saying then yes to a particular way of life. Christianity is a way of life. So when I told you last week Christians aren't born, they're made, you have to be kind of taught the way of life. And God doesn't go, I'm going to keep that a secret and you guess. No, God says, these are the ways I want you to live. And for the Christian then, that's answering the question of, what do we do? What do we do? And the Ten Commandments give us a way to understand what we do. And it's two directions. It's what we do in our life with God, and it's what we do in our life with our neighbor. All right, so we can talk about it being in two directions, how we live with God, how we live with the neighbor. Oftentimes then the commandments are broken up into two groups, and it's with those two directions. The first group is commandments, sorry, this is going to take so long to write. Commandments 1 through 3 are the first group, and those are the ones that are really dealing with this relationship of God and people. The second group of commandments is 4 through 10, and that's dealing with the way that we deal with one another. Sometimes, if you want to get real fancy, this is called the first table of the law. This is called the second table. And the reason they're split up that way is the first three deal vertically, the second deal horizontally. And of course, they all fit together. And really, you would make kind of a cross shape. And we might say the cross actually brings together all this stuff. But it's a way to break up the commandments and put them into categories. And sometimes in art, you'll see them broken down that way. So here's the text of the first commandment. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods. Now, the Ten Commandments are something you need to memorize. And so we'll be giving you little catechisms, and you need to have them memorized because this is really important for your life with God. God is telling you, this is the life I want to guide you through. And the most important one and the fundamental one is God identifies who God is, and then God tells you, this is what our life together is going to look like. So you'll notice that I wrote the name I am and just called it a name, or I wrote the words I am in capital letters. That's not a mistake. This is God's name that God gives to Moses in the burning bush. So Moses says, God, if you're going to send me to the Pharaoh, who should I say sent me? And God says, tell them I am who I am. So God doesn't give a name like, all right, well, tell him Steve said, free the slaves of Egypt. He just simply says, I am. And so now this is God reasserting that identity. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods but me. Now, one of the things we need to ask ourselves then is, well, other gods, what could those be? And a way you can think about it is, what is most important to you? What is most important to you? What is it that you love the most? We could say what, maybe even who. Who do you love the most? We're not talking about buying statues and worshiping them and having little figurines in your room, though it could be that. What we're talking about is those things that we love more than anything else, those things that are most important to us. If it's not God, and in this case the God who appeared on Mount Sinai, and the God who sends Jesus to do his work and go to the cross, then our affections and our desires get in the way of the relationship. So God says, yes, this relationship I'm giving you, you'll have an abundant life. And sometimes we say, okay, God, that's cool, but can you be like number 2 or 3 on the list? And so God's saying right from the beginning, I'm God. I need to be number 1 in your life. I need to be number 1 in your life. And God makes it very clear that as much as we would like to kind of fudge it and be like, okay, God, I'm going to give you like half an hour, and then I'm going to give this other thing I love half an hour. No, God has to be number 1. And so what is it that could be other gods? Sometimes in the Bible, it can be money. It can be power. It can be influence. It can be sex. It can be food. It can be status. It can be, the list goes on and on and on and on and on. It can be anything that you love more than God. And I'd say money and power are probably 2 of the biggest things in the world, at least in our world, that would be something we love and trust more than we trust God. Okay, that actually brings us to one of the important words when we explain, well, what exactly does this mean? One of the words is trust, one of the words is love, and one of the words is fear. These are the 3 words we use when we're talking about the 10 Commandments. And so what God is telling us is, trust me, number 1, love me, number 1, fear me, number 1. Now, fear is kind of a dangerous theological word because he's not saying, like, be afraid, hide under the bed when I come. But it's kind of like, well, it's not kind of like, this is what it is. Remember that you're not God. All right? That's a big deal. Because sometimes the God we put in front of the God of the Bible is simply us. We make ourselves most important. Our whole lives become most important. So when we say fear God, remember that you're not God. If you look at this list of words, you can think of it this way too. It's kind of a meaningless question to say, do you believe in God? But really, who do you trust the most? Who do you trust the most? And that's a way to get at this commandment. Who do you love the most? That's a way to get at this commandment. Who do you fear the most? And again, not in the sense of being afraid like you're in a dark room, but how do you understand your place in the universe? And sometimes we think too highly of ourselves, or actually we just think wrong about ourselves. We don't think enough of ourselves in the way that God loves us. So who do you trust the most? Who do you love the most? How is it that you find your proper place in God's universe? And this first commandment then opens up a world for us. That's why it's called the 10 words. It's not just one line and then it's done. It kind of opens up a whole vista where we can look and learn about God. So if you want to have some discussion questions, here are just some simple ones. Who did God give the 10 commandments to? Who was the person in the book of Exodus that God gave the 10 commandments to? What mountain did God appear to Moses on? What mountain did God appear to Moses on? What name does God give to Moses? What 2 directions do the commandments point us in? What 2 directions do the commandments point us in? And the final and perhaps most important question, and the question we'll discuss together in class, what is the first commandment and what does it mean? What does it mean in your life to talk about loving God first, trusting God first, fearing God, remembering that you are not God? What does it mean to you? And that's what we'll be processing together next Wednesday night. Till then, have a great week.